there's a lot of uncertainty in building a startup, right? Like you can have the best possible plan and it'll likely nothing will go as planned.
Yeah.
But I think the exercise of thinking through it is very important because it gives you some sort of North Star on knowing what it is you're heading towards and whether or not the thing you're heading towards is actually correct.
This is Funded, a show where founders who raised millions in venture capital share the gritty side of what it actually took to get that money in the bank. I'm Jason Ye. Not too long ago, I was trying to get my ideas funded. And back in the day, I was a VC listening to founders pitch me for money. I'm a believer in the idea that everything you've done in your past prepares you for your future. When I look at my own career, from running product at big tech companies to being a VC for 5 years, running 2 venture-backed startups, and now what I'm doing at Funded and Adamant, it all kind of makes sense. But it didn't always. That's the journey of being an entrepreneur. Today's guest, Nancy Su, founder and CEO of Moonhub, has been on quite the journey herself. From her days training for the US math and physics team to her academic pursuits at Stanford and her stint as a software engineer at Facebook, Nancy's path seemed to be pulling her into the world of academia. But her love for ideas and her desire to make a tangible impact led her down a different road, which ultimately led her to start Moonhub, the world's first AI-powered recruiter, which she successfully raised over $10 million for in less than 2 years. A lot of her success was created during her time researching and learning about AI, where she was able to build credibility as well as a lot of important relationships. As always, before we get into her fundraise, I wanted to learn a little bit more about what inspired her to go down the entrepreneurial path. And it turns out, it runs in her blood.
I was born in China and I came to the United States when I was quite young. So I was 2 at the time. My parents are immigrants to the States. They came here originally for their grad school and education, and later, of course, now they live in the Bay Area with me as well. Um, I would say my story is quite similar to many of the sort of immigrant stories you might hear in the United States. I think a lot of what my personal childhood is shaped by is seeing my own parents first come here for school. Later, both my parents were entrepreneurs, seeing them run their
Hmm.
own companies. And I like to say, I think for me personally, I didn't know there was any other career besides starting your own company, which I think is quite different from what a lot of people experience growing up. But I think it's also quite common for a lot of folks who are immigrants to the States here. I You asked about the personality type as a child. I would say I've always been a bit of a tomboy, so I love everything adventurous, everything outdoorsy, um, and also a bit of a nerd. So I've always, my greatest intellectual passion is math. I love doing math problems. It's like the nerdiest possible hobby you could have, but I really do enjoy just thinking and learning more about the world.
Awesome.
Uh,
So
and
you talk,
yeah, go
it's
ahead.
funny, you talk about having these role models, and your parents, entrepreneurs, ran their own companies. You talk about being hardworking and nerdy, all these things I can
Sure.
totally see. One part of it that I wanted to dig a little bit into is like, what was your relationship with money and asking favors? Because if your parents were running s- startups, were running companies, were entrepreneurs, they were probably not raising venture capital dollars. I'm guessing. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, like there is a portion of what you're doing now that requires you to go out, ask for favors, ask for money. And I wonder if anything that you were like as a kid hints at your comfort level with that or your discomfort with that. Like, what was your relationship with money
Hmm.
growing up?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I've never really thought about that question before, Jason, of my perception of money as a child. I will say a lot of my I've always been someone who's very driven by ideas as opposed to perhaps uh, I think money is the mechanism to which you can make an impact in the world. It's never been the end goal for me
Mhm.
personally. I think for my parents, I will caveat and just go back and say I know in Silicon Valley, when people think entrepreneurs, they think startup founders. So when I say entrepreneurs, this is very different. So my father was a classic, tech entrepreneur in the sense that you think of in Silicon Valley. But my mother ran more of a, like a small business, local small business. So very different worlds there. And I think that's allowed me to see both the ups and downs and roller coaster of what us running a company really looks like. And I think over time you get used to that level of uncertainty in your life and it becomes the new norm in a way that I think allows me to be a better founder today. To your question about money in particular, I think as a child, I never really thought too much about money. Like I thought about it from the concept of I saw my parents working extremely hard, and that motivated me. And like for me, growing up as a child, working on Sundays was the norm, and so I never, even to this day, I think when I don't work on a Sunday, I feel like it's a luxury. And I owe it to my parents to have given me that perspective about the world and that particular element of the work ethic. But if you were to tell me, hey, was my goal in life always to earn as much money as possible, I would say it's more along the lines of trying to figure out how to make the most impact. And money has always been the mechanism to do that.
Got it.
Yeah,
So at some point, and we'll get there in a second, one of the doors that you had to open, one of the things that you had to unlock was just asking for money, getting access to more money. But
sure.
before we get there, I looked at your profile and your background, extremely impressive, tons of education, big logos. Um, so you were at Stanford, and then you were a software engineer at Facebook, and then looked like you were about to go down this path of being an academic, but at some point things changed. I'm not, I want to hear a little bit about how that shift happened. We don't have to spend too much time on that, but we'll quickly on ramp into actually raising money for the company. But I wonder if you could tell me a bit about that. It seemed like your role models were all entrepreneurs, but you did have this, at least a line item on your resume that seems like you thought about being an academic. What was going on there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually think this is a wonderful segue into some of the inspiration for starting Moonhub as a company.
Hmm.
I have always, going back to my early point, I have always considered myself to be a bit of a nerd. I love research. I love thinking about the world in terms of interesting, complex systems, and I just love the act of learning. And for for a good while, I wrestled with these two different worlds, right? One is go be an entrepreneur, which is sort of the career path that I had grown up experiencing and seeing. And then the other side is more of the intellectual element of, when I was younger, I trained for the U.S. math team, the U.S. physics teams. I did a lot of these very, I would say, for lack of better word, highly competitive intellectual activities. And I always felt like it was a place where I was quite good. But the caveat is I do think for me, the impact element at the end of the day overrides the sort of pure personal joy of just doing something intellectual. And that's where, being an entrepreneur eventually wins over being an academic. But I do think it's something I've always sort of identified with the ways of thinking that a lot of people think about when they pursue research, like this idea of, running a hypothesis, having a certain level of focus, having a certain vision that is more than the next 1 to 2 years, but something that's longer term, 5 to 10 years. And I think a lot of that transitions very well into being an entrepreneur as well.
Awesome. So at some point, making that impact through building a company beats out the intellectual focus of pursuing your PhD and spending a
Yeah.
life in academia. And so where I'd love to like fast forward to in that part of the timeline is really this decision that you want to leave your PhD program to start a company. In particular, I want to know when you were like, well, I want to start a company. Were you like, I'm going to start a company and I know it's the type of company that I'm going to need to raise money for? Or were you like, maybe I can bootstrap this? How did you think about the idea and capitalizing it?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do think over time I've gotten a much deeper appreciation for different funding models that can be pursued
Hmm.
in terms of being a founder or being an entrepreneur. And for me personally, when I started Moonhub, it was clear that this was the kind of company that would require venture funding. And so we went out, we raised capital, we did the typical startup path.
Before you
But
go
that
on,
said,
can you say more on that? Like, what about Moon were you like, this is going to be a company that needs capital in the start? What about it? Like, triggered that?
Sure. Yeah. I would I would say our vision is very ambitious, and as an artifact of that, so at Moonhub, our mission is to enable access to opportunity for every person on this planet with AI. And specifically, the way we do that is by building an AI powered recruiter. Now, today in the world that we see right now, I don't think AI is at the point where out of the box you can build this, right? So
Mm.
there is a lot of product and technology innovation that needs to happen in order to make this a reality. And that's where, you know, there is a larger upfront capital investment required to build a company like Moonhub, which is not required of every business, right? And frankly, if you can go build a business that makes billions in revenue and you don't need that upfront funding, like by all means, you should go do it. But I think for the particular type of business we're trying to build at Moonhub that requires very specialist and expert talent to be working on the team. Um, it's a highly competitive space we work in that's moving very quickly. So you need a lot of capital to go to market. Like this all necessitates a certain level of upfront investment and funding, which is more synonymous with what you see typical venture capital looking like.
Awesome. That makes total sense, and
Yeah.
that was my assumption as well. I just wanted to hear the founder articulate it a little bit more. Um, I have a lot of interesting questions in a path that I want to take this conversation slightly different than other
Yeah.
founders I talk to. But before we get there, what would help is to have clarity or a little bit more clarity around what actually happened in your fundraising in 2023. And the reason I say this is because when we prepare for interviews, just jump on Crunchbase and see what was announced. And you can never
Hmm.
quite tell exactly what was happening because Crunchbase picks up on when a round was announced, not necessarily when it was done. Sometimes things get split up for various reasons. But at least on
Yeah.
Crunchbase, it looks like you raised three successive rounds in 2023, spaced apart by a few months each. Um, I don't know what's comfortable sharing, but if you could just tell me a little bit about what happened when you went out to say raise that first tranche of capital and subsequently after that, that would provide a good launch point for us to have like a fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely happy to share that. And I will say what is published in the media is not always the same as what
Totally.
the company is actually going through. So we've raised a couple rounds of funding. Um, in 2022, when we first started the company, we raised a round at the time. That round was led by Khosla, GV, some amazing investors, as well as individuals like folks out there that you might know, like Ram Shriram, Susan, who used to be over at the CEO of YouTube in the past, and a lot of others, AI visionaries that I had known from my time at Stanford, as well as the head of the CS department at Berkeley, etc. Now, after that round, we started building out Moonhub, and we started going to bat, essentially building this AI powered recruiter. And what we quickly realized is that unlike many companies, we wanted to start this not by a technology first solution, but by actually trying to figure out exactly what it was that recruiters at these recruiting agencies were doing today. So when we first started Moonhub, we actually built out a recruiting agency. We started to observe all of the workflows of our recruiters, and then later over time, we started layering on the technology solution that we've built today. And by the time 2023 rolled around, we'd piloted this technology with a good number of customers, and we were starting to see that the AI had reached a point where it could not only automate a lot of the work that our recruiters were doing, but that there was a clear path for it to learn how to do the rest of the work that our recruiters were doing. And I think that has always been the really compelling vision for us, right? And today we help 100 plus startups. A lot of them, just raise capital. We work with a lot of these early stage founders who are trying to figure out how to hire their first couple of engineers once they raise funding. A lot of them, they'll come to Moonhub and we actually help them do that. So that was 2022. So by the time 2023 rolled around, we had a lot of interest from external investors that were not currently on our cap table um, to participate in another round with
Mm.
Moonhub. But since we'd been making revenue from pretty much the early days of starting the company, we had a good amount of runway. and we weren't actively raising at the time. So what ended up happening was we decided we were going to raise, instead of a larger Series A, which we had interest for, to do a smaller round at a similar valuation as what we'd have raised if it was a Series A, but take less dilution as a company, so
Mhm.
that we could extend our runway, but also, continue to grow without having to worry too much about fundraising for a couple of years.
Awesome. That helps a lot, and that sort of breaks down. It was
Yeah,
it was a little bit confusing because of when the dates were. Um, so
sure.
where I'd like to have a short conversation is um, maybe talking a little bit about the two fundraising rounds and acknowledging some of the advantages you had, or like the things that made fundraising smoother for you than maybe others. And it's, I think what I'd like that to represent is not like showing off or anything like that, but exactly the things that certain founders can strive towards, or like as they're building their career and thinking in the future, at some point I might raise capital for a future company.
Mm.
Um, would love to like maybe even deconstruct that first round of capital and maybe you tell us a little bit about what was at play here. What did people know about you? What were they excited about? So that people understand, like, well, one, like you might have had advantages, but it probably took a bunch of hard work to get to those advantages and like years of relationship building. I'm speculating, but maybe we can start there and just like let's talk about that first round of capital. You wanted to go raise. I'm not sure if you knew exactly how much. Excuse me, but maybe describe a little bit about what your first move was to say, like, I want to raise capital. Who did you call? Who did you talk to even start strategizing what this would look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I just want to say, I think it's wonderful that you're running this podcast, Jason, because a lot of people don't have much transparency into how this process runs. And the only time they really experience it is when they're running the process themselves. And I think a lot of people can benefit from learning a bit more about what it looks like for other founders, so that they
Yeah.
have some context going in, and are well prepared for that experience. So you asked what went well in that process, or what do I think contributed to the process going well. So we had a relatively quick process for our first round. At the time, it was just myself as a founder going out, basically pitching this idea that we were going to work on. I think there's a couple things that worked in our favor. One is the general level of interest in AI and my personal background. Right, when I was at Stanford, I had worked on some of the um, early work in large language models, or these sort of foundational AI models that were being published, and I think that definitely contributes to a certain level of founder fit for the problem. But
Yep.
there's sort of there's several dimensions you think about as an investor, right? And this is me putting sort of the limited amount of time I spent angel investing and do for friends. It's like the team, the market, and then the last is like the executional element of things. So team, you want to make sure you have the right founder for that opportunity. I think for us too, I from from my education, also some of the work that I'd done after Stanford, I had a couple relationships with investors that I knew we wanted to work with. So that was relatively um, an easy introduction in the beginning. And then
Mhm.
also my PhD advisor, he personally had started several startups, and Dave, who's now one of our investors at GV, had also backed several of my PhD advisors' companies. So that's, obviously a helpful introduction as well. I would say as a founder, a lot of people think about how do we how do we build a company to raise money? And I think this is the wrong way to think about how to build a company, frankly. I think you should really think about a company from how do we build a company that is going to be a lasting and enduring business, not how do we think about a company to raise the next round. And I
Yep.
think it actually is quite transparent when you think of, like, for a lot of investors, if you have the latter mentality, they kind of get it. So, like, you should really just figure out how are we going to build a great company, and like be very transparent and honest in the process. That's always been my approach. And you know, investors there will be investors who don't like your vision or the way that you're approaching the problem, and all is good, right? And a year later, you get more traction. You go back to them, and um, they might be interested again.
Yeah.
So. I wouldn't worry too much about the no's in the process as well.
Awesome. So that starting point makes a lot of sense. You were a deep, deep subject matter expert. Your experience shows that, and it happened to be a subject matter expert in a field slash market that was about to explode, like was on the cusp of exploding. And so the timing couldn't have better for you to start that outreach for capital, and then of course having some connections where people lend their credibility to you, create a warm introduction to have a start. This is super helpful. Now, that's for your first round of capital, and it's always great to be able to raise that first round of capital with some of those advantages. A lot of those advantages go away once you launch, right? Like a lot of your first stuff is belief, belief capital and people betting on the future. But the moment you take in that money and you start executing, something else has to be at play for the next round of investors to come in. It sounds like from your initial description, you didn't need money, right? Like you raised a decently large pre-seed round and you were generating revenue right away. So something was happening along the way that allowed you to go preemptively, like raise another round of capital before you needed stuff. If you had to guess what was happening, or what were people on the outside observing, either like through announcements you were making or meetings that you were taking, like what was creating the heat around you and the company without you even having to say that, oh, we want to go raise another round of capital?
Nancy nailed it when she emphasized focusing on building a long-lasting company instead of building a company that could raise capital. Make sure you're taking the time to reframe your mindset around what it actually means to raise capital and why you're fundraising. When we come back from the break, Nancy shares how she was able to generate heat for her raise.
Like many of you, my last venture-backed startup was a SaaS business. In that company early on, we had the opportunity to sell into a large enterprise, but ran into some walls when they asked us if we were SOC 2 certified. Not only were we not certified, we also found out that it would take our small team a ton of time to get that done, and so we ended up abandoning the deal. If you haven't run into a situation like that where a potential customer or investor is asking if you're SOC 2, HIPAA, GDPR, or ISO 27001 certified, you probably will soon. But unlike me, you could use a company called Vanta to help. Vanta helps automate up to 90% of the compliance work, getting you audit ready in weeks rather than months, and eliminating up to 85% of the costs. Not only that, but Vanta can start small with you and scale up as you grow, helping you land bigger deals and earn customer trust. The best part is, Vanta is offering funded listeners $1,000 off for going to vanta.com/funded. That's VANTA.com/funded for $1,000 off your service. Check it out.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jason. In general, when you start to be more public about what you're working on as a company, you will get inbound interest from investors who want to talk with you. And it doesn't necessarily mean they want to invest in the company, right? I think it's a lot of it is just starting to build a relationship with founders. It's part of their job.
Yeah.
And I think in that process, if you are transparent about your intentions, I think most people like you. I think it's very fair to be like, look, I'm not looking to raise now, but here are some things I'm thinking about. Can you help me with XYZ thing? And I think a lot of that is a process of building relationships with investors that you like and maybe would like to participate in your next round. And as they get to know more and more about the business, I think if there's if they think there's a synergy and there's some kind of inflection point happening in the company, then they may come to you and say, hey, we would like to do the round before that inflection point, as a way of basically preempting around with you. In our particular case, so that's like how investors heard about us. To be quite honest, like after we did some PR, or we had some PR cover us after we decided to more publicly launch the company, and after that, a lot of investor inbound comes in. We also happen to work in a space where a lot of our customers are startups. So because of this, the startups use Moonhub. we help them hire out their founding teams, and then inevitably their investors go and ask those teams like, oh, there's like you've hired this amazing like couple of people. How did you hear? How did you do this, etc.? And then
Yeah.
they hear about Moonhub, and then they want to come talk to us. So there's also this like secondary funnel, which is a little bit more specific to Moonhub. But because of that, what happens is, investors will talk to you. And then for us, like, I think the actual inflection point was the fact that we were going to more publicly launch what we were working on later in 2023. And I think that catalyzes a lot of interest for investors who want to, of course, get in before you more publicly launch. And in some ways they're making a bet that the launch is going to go well, and it did go well. And we got all the traction we expected and more. And so I think it was a good bet for them before it happened. And I do think there is usually some kind of inflection point, or you're experiencing a lot of growth that gets them to want to hop on before things get even bigger, kind of thing.
I love the call out that you made in the sort of generalist, the generalized setting of, in general, when you're building, if you announce a round, people will, or announce a public product launch, you will have investors that reach out. And the one small thing that you might have glazed over, which I think is quite important to hear, is when people reach out, like you can almost tax them. You can almost be like, sure, could you help with this, and see if they're actually able to show value before they become an investor. That not only one brings in value for the company, but also gives you more surface area to create a relationship with the investor. And I think that's helpful in both directions, right? Investors want to feel comfort around the team that they're backing. And if they have more touch points with the founder to understand who they are, how they think, how they execute, that can be very helpful and convincing to them to invest in the future rounds. And then, everyone should be playing in a way where they're like, we believe we'll have a lot of options, right? If you don't believe that, then it's going to be harder for you to fundraise anyways. But if you believe that you're going to have a lot of options, then part of what you need to do is like to start dating, and like seeing who these investors are, seeing if you like spending time with them, because it is a relationship that is going to be around for a while. So great call outs there. I wonder, like, everything I've heard so far feels very smooth, right? It feels very like clean and like fits into a great box. I tend to think that rarely is the case. Like 100% of what happened was just super easy.
Sure.
Is there anything that comes to mind around like challenging times when it came to raising capital, or I don't know, experiences that like really hurt? Anything that you could share?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have been quite lucky in that every time we've raised capital, it's always been relatively smooth. And what I tell a lot of founders is, it's always best to raise capital when you don't need it, because that's when you have the most leverage in the conversations. And I think first round, exception being like, you kind of have to raise money to start the company, at least in our case. But the second round, at least that's what we did, and what I hope will happen in the future as well. I think in terms of what didn't go well, I think it's more about I think it's very important before you raise money, why you're raising it and how much you need to raise it. And to be honest, I think we were rushed into that process a little bit when we raised our second round, because it was not something we had really, like, my mind was basically, let's figure out how to launch this product, let's hire more people, let's go build the product. It wasn't really, I'm like, okay, let's think about our next round of fundraising. So I do think in some ways we were a little bit like rushed into that process, and we could have spent a little bit more time thinking in advance. Like after your first round of fundraising, start to think about, okay, what are the milestones you want to hit for the second round? How much do you want to raise? What are how are you thinking about the fundraising? Like, in the back of my mind, I sort of knew what that timeline would look like. But to be honest, I think we could have thought more about it during the process. And the process was like, we're talking like a week here. So it wasn't like too much time to think about things. One piece of generalized advice I would say is for a lot of the companies. So like a lot of companies come to Moonhub after they raise a round, and then because of the round, they're able to hire more people. And so we work with a lot of companies like that. And sometimes I ask them about how their rounds go. And and things. And I will always say the best piece of advice I would give is like once you raise your first round, start to think about what the deck would look like for your second round. Not because you're thinking about how to go raise the second round, right? But because like you're starting to think about what are the milestones you want to actually hit before you reach it, so that you don't get to a point where like I have 6 months of runway. Have I really thought about like have I actually hit the milestones I'm trying
Yeah.
to hit here? Right. And I think that that level of structure is important.
I love that. Like for similar but different reasons, I love that advice. It's like also like trying to put together your narrative of like what your narrative would be talking to investors and call it 12 months kind of dictates a little bit about your strategy too. It's like it's
Mm.
a different way of thinking about executing strategy through the lens of, well, I'm going to have to tell people what we're doing, what we're trying to execute against, what we've done well. And it's
Yeah.
one of the things that I like really lean in on when helping founders think through this. It's like sometimes people are like, I got to like come up with a story and I've got to like, put it together in a nice deck. And it feels like a song and dance that you're just putting on for investors. To a certain extent,
Mm.
maybe it is a little bit, but there's a lot of value in the rigor around like pulling together exactly what you're focused on, what do you want to spend time on. So I love that idea of just maybe start thinking about it really, really like crazy early, right after you raise your last round. There's a lot of benefits from that. Um,
Yeah. And look, there's a lot of uncertainty in building a startup, right? Like you can have the best possible plan and it'll likely nothing will go as planned.
yeah,
But I think the exercise of thinking through it is very important because it gives you some sort of North Star on knowing what it is you're heading towards and whether or not the thing you're heading towards is actually correct, right? And I can tell you internally at Moonhub, people know that I'm very big on basically just like ruthless prioritization and focus. So we every quarter we publish these are the top three priorities we're working on as a team. And if you're not working on one of these three priorities, like you got to rethink like what you're doing towards those three priorities. And I think it applies to like longer term company decision making as well, right? It's not just like, okay, this is the hypothetical deck for the Series A or the Series B, but it's also um, if we want to, let's say, make $100 million of revenue in 5 years, like what are the real concrete steps that we need to be making each year?
yeah,
And then from there, okay, am I actually on track to get to that point in 5 years, or about maybe you're exceeding expectations? Who knows? But having that concept of what it takes, and oftentimes it's a very enlightening process to go through that exercise every couple months.
super cool. And then the last thing I love asking founders who come on is you raised a couple rounds of capital, are off to the races. And I tend to believe that founders who are in the mix like tend to see the best founders coming up. And in case any names come to mind where you're like, I'd love for you to, you should keep an eye on this one person. They've either just started a company or they're going to start a company. And I'll tell you, Christina
Okay.
Cassiopo, the founder of Vanta, came on our podcast like almost 2 years ago, and she had just raised her Series A. She's raised, 100 million plus since, I think. And when we asked her this question, she was like, I love this guy, Bobby Pinero. He's like building this tool that he wish he had. And like, I don't think any rounds, I think she had just angel invested in him. And he just came on our podcast after, raising his Series A. So anyways, I don't know if there are any names like that you want to, roll the dice and see if you can call your shot, but any names we should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, definitely some. I'm just trying to think. We work with a good number of companies that are quite early stage and not public about what they're working on.
Yeah.
Um, and in terms of the early stage startup environment, the non-obvious ones, I'll give a shout out to a couple interesting AI startups that I've seen recently. So one is this company U.com. It's a consumer search engine, a little bit more late stage. I think they're doing some really cool work on sort of more consumer side search.
Hmm.
Another company, by the way, a lot of these are our customers too. So this is, but I'm not mentioning them because they're customers. I genuinely think they're cool opportunities out there. Another company I recently saw was another one of our customers called Marvery. It's very early. I think they're still quite stealthy about what they're doing. But the founder had actually previously IPO'd a company that he founded that was more in the sort of 3D design space, and is now doing the reverse of that with AI. If you can imagine, like, how do you build those 3D designs with AI to start, instead of manufacturing and printing them? There's a lot of cool ones. There's a company called Whisper, which is a company that we've hired several computational neuroscientists in very niche roles for. That's one of those companies where you're like hunting down the 10 people in the world
Yeah.
that are a good fit for the opportunity. That they basically design like a device that you wear, and you can think about things that you want to say, and it will transcribe them for you. So
Boy.
it uses like very small muscular twitches that happen in your neck, and you think about a concept, and then they actually are able to use that to like as a form of communication, which I think is quite cool, and it works.
Holy
That's why I
shit.
think like a very
That's
critical part. So
insane. I'm glad that
um,
that was the one that
lots of
you ended up on, man.
yeah, lots of
Um,
interesting ideas out there.
well, Nancy, that was great. That was a very cool conversation. Awesome to hear how you got Moonhub kicked off, raised the capital to do so, and we've been following along from the sidelines, but excited to see all the stuff that you do. And yeah, this was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate you having me on, Jason, and had a lot of fun.
Cool.
And if any of your founders are hiring, come
Yes.
check us out. We'd love to help you
Moonhub.
out.
So the shout out would be moonhub.ai.
Yes, moonhub.ai. You're also welcome. You can just email me, nancy@moonhub.ai, and we'd love to help you hire and scale your teams.
Love that.
That was my conversation with Nancy Su, founder and CEO of Moonhub, the world's first AI-powered recruiter. I hope this episode helped you gain a new perspective around venture capital and what it takes to scale your company. After the break, I'll be sitting down with my producer, Paige, to talk about the main takeaways from our conversation. I get it. Trusting your pitch deck to just any designer can be nerve-wracking, especially when it comes to fundraising. That's why we've created Adamant Deck Design, where amazing design meets fundraising expertise that you can rely on. We design your deck up to 15 slides, give you 2 rounds of feedback and revisions, and even add 3 bonus template slides for future work so that you can creatively customize your deck without us. Throughout your redesign, we incorporate design thinking proven to be effective in Adamant's fundraising work. If you're looking for more detailed work around your story and narrative, make sure to check out our Design Plus Story Engineering tier. That's an add-on that a lot of people love. You can trust Adamant Deck Design for your fundraising success. Just head to admnt.com/deck to learn more and reach out if you'd like to work with us.
Hey, P, how are you doing?
A little jet lagged from yesterday,
Jet?
but
I am the worst with jet lag. So, I travel quite a bit and into different time zones. And whether it's not shifting time zones or shifting time zones, travel just completely wipes me out.
I actually enjoy the airport, weirdly enough. But when I have yesterday I had a long layover, and it just really, really got to me. But I'm back, and I'm excited to talk about this episode because, and I feel like I say this every time, Nancy was very, like this whole episode, it just felt so beautifully laid out, like her whole story.
Yeah.
Even though I did find it interesting, and you guys touched on this a little bit, but she kind of was going down this path of academia, and she was getting her PhD at Stanford for AI and all of this stuff that gives her the perfect credentials for Moonhub and what she's doing now. So I did think it was a super interesting episode, and into more of the raise information. Everything seemed to be so smooth and laid out. I'm not sure if that's actually how it was, and she was just giving us the pretty picture. But I did find a lot of like the knowledge and insights that she shared to be super useful. I just want to hear your first thoughts on the episode and the conversation.
Yeah, I think her fundraising, it's almost always messier than people let on, but her trajectory around raising capital, given her background and how it all came around, probably was one of the smoother fundraising paths. And one thing that I'll point out is that I really like the fact that she was going down a path of getting her PhD,
Mhm.
which is different than getting your MBA, for example. Because like if you're getting your MBA, and I'm just thinking about myself, you get your MBA, if you've got an MBA, it's some of the expectation is that you should start a company, you should be an entrepreneur, you should do these things. And because of that, I see a lot of MBAs who jump into businesses that they probably shouldn't start just because they feel like the expectation is that they should start a business and they're just looking for the thing. In fact, when I say that, I'm really speaking about myself. It's like I have felt this intense pressure to live up to what people expected me to do. Whereas
Hmm.
with Nancy, I think she was really happy to go deep in academia and really like study the science. And because of that, I feel like starting Moonhub only happened because there was this real pull. Like it had
Yeah.
to happen. She had to do this, right? And then the fundraising happened because the fundraising kind of pulled her into it as opposed to her like chasing something down. And so because of that and all that background, I really do think it was a great setup, great background, great understanding of problem, and then fundraising just kind of pulled her along. So might have
Yeah.
been the smoother one.
And I think it's interesting to note that all of that is great and like smooth sailing, but at the same time, it's like she still had to prove herself at Stanford in order to be able to get those connections and those intros. Like she mentioned that her advisor for her PhD, he also ran a few startups. He had done a little bit of investments, and he knew someone from Google Ventures that's now an investor for Moonhub, and he obviously made that introduction. She was like, obviously that was huge. And in my head when I was listening to it, I'm like, I mean, in order to make that introduction though, he had to really trust you or else
That's
he
it.
would have probably said no. So I just wanted to call that out to be like, even if you're set up at that advantage, you still kind of have this other layer to prove with like, with all the connections that you do have to be like, oh, she's legit, and pass her on.
Totally. Great call out. I mean, I think to layer it on a little bit more, especially at Adamant and Funded, we are deeply aware of some of the um, inequalities and advantages that certain people have. Some might not be justified, and it's an easy thing to get upset or an easy thing to get annoyed about. Like, oh, these people with these logos, that's why they got funded and they had all the access. They have all these advantages, and that's like it's like a pretty common storyline to pick up on in the world of Twitter, et cetera. But let's take a step back and say, yeah, but in some of these cases, she has a Stanford degree and network, but it's not like they were giving those away. Like they
Yeah.
weren't just like, who out there that we think is an interesting profile who fills some kind of DEI requirement do we want to give an opportunity to pursue like a
Yeah. Yeah.
PhD in AI? No, that's not what happened. She's obviously incredibly smart. And then at the next stage, sure, being part of that community, which she earned for being
Hmm.
as crazy intelligent and driven as she is, well, then she met some people. But even at that point, they would have had to have seen things based on their
Yes.
experiences with her that made them believe this is worth my introducing to this person, this person, this person. So, there is some stuff that we can get annoyed at in this world, but then let's make sure we give people the recognition they deserve when they earned it and they worked hard and they got into these places of better access to capital because of accomplishments, of real
Yeah.
accomplishments, right?
Totally. I couldn't agree more. And I did want to bring something up though that she mentioned that I thought was a cool strategy. I think you've talked about this with me, but I wanted to get some of your insights around this. So she brought up inbound investors and how those can kind of randomly arise if they're seeing interesting things you're doing, and how you say this all the time. You can say you're not raising, and you genuinely aren't, but you can still ask them for help around certain things. And she was mentioning this and how she kind of did that, and kind of went for getting advice from these investors when she wasn't raising. Is it possible to do that with outbound investors, where maybe you're reaching out to an investor you're not raising right now, and you're like, hey, I have no idea even if you'll do this for me, but I have a few questions that I need answered around blah 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 blah. Is that still possible if you're the one reaching out?
Sure. Almost anything's possible I think what I always try to drive people to do is take a step back and think about in any interaction that I'm about to push forward to, like, what is the psychology of the situation? What will people be thinking? So we'll take the easy one, which was inbound, right?
Yeah.
Inbound means they're interested in you. And so in a situation where they're interested in you, you've already kind of proven some sort of value that they are evaluating. And when it comes to like doing things for founders, you're trying as an investor, if you think, oh my God, I might want to invest in Paige in the future, there's an opportunity for you to like activate a bit of that feeling of reciprocity where if I help her today, she'll feel like
Mhm.
I did something for her. And maybe in the future, when we're competing for a deal, it'll be in the back of her mind and she'll want to work with me. Or like maybe doing something for her will like start building relationships. So that's obvious, right? Like if we know that I want you, then we can set up that dynamic. And Nancy was able to then ask for advice, ask for help. And I think that's an amazing way to handle inbound and to like establish relationship with that while also pulling value out for the company.
Yeah.
Now, the question about outbound is a good one. And a lot of times we talk about outbound and getting intros first before you're fundraising and having the having the background for why you're reaching out be that you'd like advice or you'd like insights or you'd like some things that they know. Now, this can be done for sure, but it has to be done in a way where the investor that's hearing from you believes that you're valuable. So
Yeah.
the easiest version of this would be if I got introduced to you, Paige, by Jonathan Lee, who you know and trust and you think is amazing. If Jonathan goes, hey, Paige, will you meet this entrepreneur, Jason Ye? I've worked with him for a few years. I think he's really talented and he's doing some interesting things. I don't think he's fundraising, but you should meet him.
Yeah.
Then, when that introduction gets made, you've been primed by someone that you trust that this is a great entrepreneur. And in your head, there might be a future opportunity to invest. So we've again recreated the situation that Nancy
Okay.
got on an inbound. The harder one
Uh,
might be for cold outreach, right? Cold is difficult because the thought always goes through an investor's mind of like, well, why am I hearing from this person? If they couldn't get me through an introduction, like are they even that valuable? Most good companies can find me in different ways. And so you have to navigate that. But if you were able to craft an email that had something to do with your background, you went to SUNY Buffalo and I went to SUNY Buffalo too, and I saw that about you and I thought to myself, I would love to contact Paige. By the way, I'm working on this company and it looks like you have a background in it. If you have time over the next couple of weeks, would love to meet another. What do you call them? Buffs? What do you call their stuff?
I don't know. It's Buffalonian.
Buffos, a fellow buffo. And you're like you're leveraging something to then make sure that their thought isn't, oh my god, this founder is desperate. This founder is trying to like trap me into talking to them. This is going to be a terrible
Yeah.
company. But if you can set those things up, then the ask for advice, the ask for other things other than fundraising is a good one, but not always straightforward and easy to set up.
That is really good advice right there. I want to encourage anyone listening to go back and take notes because you just gave them like three laid out options of how you could go about
Yeah.
getting advice from investors while you're not raising, and all of them were spot on. So thank you for answering that. I did have one more thing that I wanted to talk about, which is she was talking about how she got a lot of interest from investors right after she publicly launched Moonhub.
Yeah.
So she basically launched Moonhub, I think, I'm going to assume, in a way to boost her raise. Even if she didn't, though, say she didn't. My question is around Wh- do you always want to do that? In my mind, my answer is always like yes, because you want to be drawing it. I'm not saying you have to publicly launch, but publicly launch a new product after some big traction happens, after something happens within the company. I feel like that's probably the smartest way to launch a fundraise because there's interest being drawn to you. Whereas, you just go out and raise a random month and you're like, oh, I'm starting.
Yeah.
But there's not, because you want to have something that you could showcase to investors. So that's where my mind was heading. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on it as well.
Sure. I mean, I think your instincts are good, and you've learned so much with us, Paige. These debriefs are doing their job. I think on one level, yes, if you have momentum in your company and things are happening and progress is being made, that's the kind of company that an investor would be interested in, as opposed to nothing's happening, right? So I think that's a fairly obvious thought. Um, what I try not to have founders do too much of is like put the cart before the horse or let the tail wag the dog, as in, how do I like do my company for fundraising? I would rather really think about, what is the company I'm trying to build? What are the next milestones? Does launching right now make sense? If launching
Yeah.
right now makes sense for the company, then think to myself, is this a good time to raise too? Because we're launching anyways. We'll have press, we'll have people talking about us. Maybe that'll drive momentum to actually raise capital. I would rather that be the mindset and logic that you follow. Now, of course, there are always things on the margins where you're like adjusting a little bit here and there. It's like, it would be slightly better if we did it then for fundraising,
Yeah.
so maybe adjust it. But primarily, I want to make sure people are like, we're trying to run the best company that we can. We're trying to make the best decisions for the company. And if we do those things, that should be attractive to investors. And then we'll talk to investors.
Yeah. That makes sense. I don't know. I guess my mind was thinking of it as in like, if there's nothing going on, or say it's a pre-seed,
Yeah.
and you have nothing going on in the company. I guess I can't wrap my head around how you launch a
I,
fundraise
I know what you're
when it's
saying.
so early.
I know what you're saying for sure. And one thing I'll push everyone towards is, if nothing is actually happening in the company, even at the earliest stages, if you're not making progress, if there's no motion inside the company, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't have anything to raise against, that might be true. That might be true. And maybe you shouldn't raise capital. That's kind of like the harsh reality, because the earliest stage companies, even when they're not like with tons of customers and growing like a weed, they're moving, right? They're making progress. They're
Yeah.
they're recruiting the best talent that they can. They're validating their ideas with customers. They're interviewing customers. They're putting up MVPs together. They're getting data on those things, and so there should always be something that you can talk about, some like real progress that you are
Yeah.
excited about at any stage of the company. And so everyone should be checking themselves if they're like, oh my God, I need to make something up to fundraise. That might actually mean, you know what, you're not ready to fundraise. You should probably go back to the drawing board and really see what you need to work on within the company first before you're even in a state to go ask people for money.
That's the debrief.
Is that the debrief?
That's the debrief.
If you're looking for more insights, strategies, and support around fundraising, subscribe to our newsletter. It's at fundedpod.com/newsletter. And find me on social. I'm at Jayeh, that's JAYYEH, on almost every platform. I respond to DMs and newsletter replies, so hit me up. This episode was produced by Paige Randall.
Hey guys.
Thanks also to John O'Lee from Adamant.
Hey everyone.
And as always, one last thanks to our sponsor, Vanta, the leading automated security and compliance platform.